What happened when my life was ignored by my own mother will shock you. Looking back, I can clearly see what my life was like before that episode that changed everything. It was a normal routine, but full of invisible tensions that no one else seemed to notice. My mother, Carolina, was always devoted to my older sister, Helena, who dealt with chronic health issues. I admired this dedication, but deep down, I felt invisible. I grew up as the youngest child, striving for attention with high grades and exemplary behavior, hoping somehow to receive the same care and recognition my sister naturally received. But it rarely worked out that way. Small frustrations built up silently within me, creating a resentment I couldn't even name. On the outside, everything seemed fine. I was studious, responsible, someone everyone considered mature for my age. Inside, I carried a constant feeling of emotional abandonment. My name is Raphael, and all of this happened when I was 17. I was in high school, planning to go to college, and at the same time, I was dealing with complex family dynamics. My older sister, Helena, suffered from asthma, chronic sinusitis, and fibromyalgia, and my mother focused all her attention on making sure she was okay. I understood the importance of this, but I couldn't ignore the emptiness I felt. I began to realize that my emotional pain had no place in that home, as if I needed to hide my problems so as not to burden my mother further. The feeling of always being in the background was overwhelming, and even when I tried to reach out or ask for help, I ended up feeling rejected or ignored. The first small tensions began to appear subtly. When I needed support for an important exam or was going through a personal difficulty, my mother was always too busy with Helena. Sometimes it was something physical. She forgot to take me to a doctor or couldn't believe the severity of a pain I was experiencing. At first, I tried to rationalize and be patient, thinking it was normal for her to be overwhelmed. But frustration snowballed inside me. I felt like my value was being ignored, that my presence and my needs didn't matter as much as my sister's. This feeling began to erode the trust I had in my mother and transform our relationship into something distant and fraught with silent resentment. Even with all this tension, I continued my activities normally. I studied, helped around the house, and tried to maintain my routine as best I could. But there was a constant weight on my chest, an anxiety I couldn't fully explain. I watched my mother dedicate herself completely to Helena and felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and guilt for feeling angry. The idea that perhaps I was exaggerating my own needs consumed me. This duality left me confused, unsure how to deal with my feelings. I often found myself crying alone or taking deep breaths to keep from exploding in the face of the situation, feeling increasingly emotionally isolated. Helena, my sister, was a constant presence of support, even with her own physical limitations. She understood my silence and, without saying much, tried to protect me from our mother's neglect. Our relationship with her was a refuge amidst the emotional chaos we were experiencing. But it didn't eliminate the weight of feeling like my suffering wasn't a priority. Each day seemed to reinforce the same pattern. My mother overwhelmed with Helena, me trying to survive emotionally, and Helena balancing what she could. This dynamic began to wear me down from the inside out, creating a tension I didn't know how to resolve until everything changed abruptly, with a medical emergency that exposed all the flaws we had ignored for so long. It was on a seemingly ordinary night that everything reached a critical point. I was experiencing intense abdominal pain, something I initially tried to ignore, thinking it was just a slight discomfort or something temporary. But the pain intensified, making every movement painful, and I began to realize I needed help immediately. I went to my mother, trying to explain the severity of my feelings, but she, absorbed in caring for Helena, interpreted my urgency as teenage drama. I felt my heart tighten as I tried to convince her that I couldn't wait. The already constant feeling of being invisible exploded into frustration and fear. I clearly saw her failure to see me as a priority. My sister Helena was by my side, trying to argue on my behalf, but she was also limited by the fear of burdening our mother. As the pain intensified, I began to panic. Each minute felt like an eternity, and despair began to take over. I felt my body burning with pain, but the worst sensation was emotional. The realization that no one truly believed me, that my voice carried no weight in my own home. I remember thinking that if something worse happened, my mother would regret it, but regret didn't bring immediate relief. The tension between my weakened body and my wounded soul was unbearable. That night was the culmination of our mother's involuntary neglect, and it marked an emotional breaking point that forever changed my relationship with her. Finally, after desperate insistence and Helena's interventions, my mother realized the situation was serious. We went to the emergency room, and the diagnosis confirmed my suspicions: acute appendicitis, something that required immediate surgery. The mixture of relief and anger inside me was intense. Relief at finally receiving medical attention, anger at realizing how much my pain had been underestimated, and fear of what emotional neglect could have caused. The feeling of vulnerability was brutal. In that moment, I understood that my own life had almost been put at risk by my lack of emotional awareness, and that I needed to find a way to protect myself, even within my own family. During her hospitalization, my mother began to confront her own guilt. She was visibly shaken, realizing that her emotional overload had led her to neglect her youngest son. It was a difficult situation for everyone. She was dealing with guilt and responsibility. I was dealing with fear and feelings of abandonment, and Helena was trying to keep the family together. It was during this time that I realized it wasn't enough to simply wait for my mother to change. I needed to find the strength within myself to deal with my emotions and rebuild the trusting relationship. I began to reflect on what it truly meant: to be heard, seen, and cared for, even when those who should protect you fail. The first hours after surgery were critical. The physical pain was intense, but something inside me was shifting. I realized I needed to take control of my own emotional life, even if my mother was still learning to recognize my limits. It was a painful but necessary awakening. From that moment on, I decided I would no longer be a passive victim of emotional neglect, but someone capable of recognizing my own feelings, seeking help when needed, and setting clear boundaries for my own protection. This awareness was the first step in my journey of overcoming grief. In the days following the surgery, I began to notice subtle changes in my mother. Carolina was trying to make amends, showing genuine concern, but there was still tension and distrust between us. I needed to deal with the mix of feelings: anger, fear, distrust, and, at the same time, the desire to re-establish a secure bond. I discovered that, to overcome the silent trauma of neglect, I needed to confront my emotions, acknowledge that my pain was valid, and express it clearly. I began writing about my feelings, recording every moment of frustration, every fear, and every small step forward. This process became a method of personal therapy, helping me externalize what had previously been bottled up inside. Helena continued to be my anchor. Her empathy and understanding helped soften some of the most difficult moments. She supported me emotionally, reminding me that I was not alone and that my pain deserved to be acknowledged. My relationship with my sister became even stronger, and I realized that her presence was essential to my recovery. She not only helped me cope with my mother's neglect, but also taught me how to balance my emotions, understand the limits of emotional overload, and build patience without forgetting myself. The feeling of sisterly connection became a solid foundation for me to face the rest of the challenge. I began to reflect on my own responsibilities. While it was unfair that I had been neglected, I realized that passively waiting for my mother to change wouldn't solve everything. It was time to become active in my own life. I researched self-care, developed routines to monitor my emotional and physical health, and learned to communicate my limits clearly. Each small step I took strengthened my confidence and lessened the weight of accumulated frustration. I discovered that overcoming didn't mean erasing the pain, but learning to walk with it, transforming the experience into strength. The process wasn't quick. There were moments of relapse, arguments with my mother, and episodes where I felt invisible again. However, each obstacle I faced taught me something new about patience, assertiveness, and forgiveness, both for myself and for my mother. I began to realize that overcoming wasn't just physical or emotional, but also relational. I needed to rebuild trust with Carolina, but in a way that protected my well-being and recognized my own importance. The realization that my pain had value was transformative. During this time, I realized my mother was learning too. Carolina began to better balance her attention between her children, recognizing that neglecting Raphael benefited no one. I saw genuine efforts, but I learned not to rely solely on them. My own emotional autonomy became a priority. I discovered that while family love is essential, each of us needs to take responsibility for our own emotional care, and this realization completely changed my perspective on relationships and trust. Over time, my physical and emotional health began to stabilize. I still felt the effects of neglect, but I learned to identify the triggers that made me relive feelings of invisibility. I developed strategies to deal with similar situations in the future, communicating my needs more clearly and assertively. Each small step forward was a victory, demonstrating that even after a painful experience, it was possible to regain emotional balance and rebuild fragile relationships. A sense of control over my own life began to replace the constant fear I carried. My relationship with my mother improved, but gradually. Carolina acknowledged mistakes, apologized sincerely, and began demonstrating consistent care without neglecting herself. I learned to accept that she was also human, with limitations, but willing to change. This change, combined with my own inner strength, created a safer and more welcoming environment. I learned that overcoming grief involves both forgiving others and learning to care for oneself, even when those who should protect us fail. The experience also transformed my perspective on resilience. I discovered that it's not necessary to face challenges alone, but that inner strength and a support network can coexist. Helena's support, my mother's efforts, and my own determination combined to create a path to recovery. Each difficulty I faced became a learning experience, strengthening my ability to deal with future adversities. I began to see the value of clear communication, empathy, and emotional balance, applying these principles to other areas of life, such as studies, friendships, and personal projects. I realized that while the initial trauma left scars, those scars also carried valuable lessons. I learned to identify signs of emotional neglect, to express my needs, and to value my own well-being. This experience taught me the importance of speaking up, seeking help, and recognizing that feeling invisible or neglected is not a weakness, but a human condition that can be transformed into strength. Each step in rebuilding family trust was accompanied by small internal victories that gave me hope and courage to move forward. Looking back today, I see that overcoming wasn't just about surviving physical or emotional pain, but learning to navigate it, understanding human limits, and rebuilding relationships with awareness and maturity. I learned that it's possible to face situations of neglect, transform pain into learning, and create an emotionally healthier future. The experience made me more empathetic, resilient, and aware that my worth doesn't depend on anyone's immediate recognition, but on the respect I have for myself. The most profound lesson I learned from this experience was understanding the importance of emotional balance within the family. My mother's involuntary neglect didn't have to define my life or my relationship with her. I discovered that it's possible to overcome a painful past without carrying resentments that corrode the present. I learned that my role isn't to incessantly blame, but to acknowledge, cope with, and transform pain into personal growth. This understanding changed the way I relate to my parents, my sister, and most importantly, myself. Furthermore, I realized the importance of building honest and transparent communication. Before, I kept everything to myself, believing that expressing my emotions would be a burden. Today, I know that sharing feelings clearly strengthens relationships and avoids misunderstandings. My mother learned to listen to me. Helena continues to be my greatest ally, and I learned that my emotions are valid and deserve attention, even when the world seems distracted or overwhelmed. This practical and emotional shift created a stronger foundation for all of us. Another significant transformation was the ability to recognize and respect my limits. Before, I tried to absorb everything and please everyone, but now I understand that self-care isn't selfishness. It's emotional survival. I developed mental and physical health habits, created self-care routines, and learned to seek external support when needed. This process gave me more confidence, reducing the feeling of vulnerability I'd carried for years. Self-compassion became a central element of my journey of overcoming obstacles. The episode of Rohr's acute appendicitis and the emotional neglect that accompanied it taught me the importance of resilience, communication, and empathy. I learned not to rely solely on others' validation to recognize my worth. Today, I can look at my mother and sister with understanding and gratitude, even while acknowledging past failures. I discovered that overcoming doesn't mean erasing the pain, but integrating it into one's own story, using it as fuel for personal growth and empowerment. Today I can confidently say that I've grown emotionally, even though the pain and scars remain. I've learned that despite neglect or lack of attention, it's possible to find strength, set boundaries, and build healthier relationships. My story isn't one of perfection, but of humanity and resilience. Today, when I face challenges, I remember what I've experienced, what I've achieved, and how capable I am of rising above, even when life seems to leave me invisible. It's possible to overcome and rebuild, and that's the lesson I carry with me every day.